Hello, I'm Dan Hissen from TLR, and today we're going to show you how to properly seal up your nitro motor. So starting off with the motor itself, this is actually an Orion 3-port kit complete with pipe. You'll see that the carburetor is detached from the motor, which is actually a good thing because we're going to need to seal the carburetor onto the motor. In taking the motor out, you just really want to be careful that when you're disassembling the motor itself, a lot of mistakes can be made in just not counting how many head shims are, their orientation, how things are assembled in the motor. So you really want to pay attention when disassembling the motor. You want to have a nice clean rag so that you can lay all the parts out, keep track of everything. I really recommend a lint-free cloth. They're available at Home Depot, any automotive store. So let's go ahead and get started. Okay. The first thing that I recommend doing is removing the head, the cooling fin, and the combustion chamber. Place everything on the rag as it came off the motor. Obviously the motor with the pilot shaft facing this way, therefore the head and its screws will remain in the same orientation. And this just avoids confusion. Some heads, as I said, actually have different slots in the cooling head to pass air over the glow plug. So it's very important that you recognize the proper direction of that and to keep the head in its original orientation. Now, the combustion chamber, that there's markings. It's very important that you keep these in their original orientation. So you can see right here that there's actually 3 little dots that face the exhaust side. Okay, now we're going to remove the combustion chamber. This can get a little bit tricky. Never use any tools to pry or to lift up the combustion chamber itself, because if the sealing surface is damaged, the performance of the motor is immediately compromised. So you really want to be careful when you pull off the head. You want to, number one, make sure that you remove it in its original orientation, and number two, there's going to be some shims below it, head shims we call them, that may or may not drop out, so you really want to be careful. I've removed the combustion chamber. The first thing I want to do is inspect. You can see right here there's actually a shim that was left. Notice I'm going to go ahead and leave the sleeve in for now. Next step is you're going to remove the back plate, and again, before you just dive in and tear anything apart, just give it a good look and you'll see that there's an arrow. You can see right here that there's an arrow pointing up. You can also see that the piston is at bottom dead center. So it's at the bottom of its stroke. Before proceeding, anytime you remove a back plate, move the piston up. That will allow clearance for the removal of the back plate. Let's go ahead and remove the back plate by removing the 4 screws. I've already removed 3 out of the 4, so let's remove the last screw. And again, before removing the back plate, make sure that the piston is as high as it can go on the bore. Again, this is a new motor, so it's tight, but the main thing you want to do is just bring it up to the point to where you can start to feel the pinch to give clearance for the removal of the back plate. You can see I'm kind of twisting and pulling the back plate, and you can begin to see why it was so important to put that piston at top dead center, or closest to the top of the bore. There's actually a groove in here that when the piston travels down, the skirt enters into this groove. You can see that if the piston was all the way down and I tried to pull it out, damage could occur to the piston and compromise the performance of the motor. Again, it's very important. Just slow down, take your time. So we're going to put the back plate over there. Now at this point, because we're only sealing the motor, it's not necessary to take the actual piston off of the crank or to inspect. Okay, now that we have the motor for the most part disassembled, or at least disassembled to the point to where we can begin to start sealing it up, what we're going to do now is start preparing all the mating surfaces for the sealant. I recommend using a nitro cleaner today we're going to be using a Nitrotech by Losi, which I've used for quite a while. It's very good. It leaves a very good clean surface with no film. I just have just a basic rag here, and what I'm going to do is apply a little bit of motor spray to the rag, and then all I want to do very carefully without dropping any dust or lint is to prepare the surfaces. We're going to start with the back plate. So just a few wipes around the mating surface of the back plate and you're good to go, or on the case rather. And then also for the mating portion of the back plate, you can see here I'm just cleaning off any assembly oil that came from the factory. And once I've made sure that I have a nice clean surface, I can begin to seal the back plate. I always recommend using a semi-drying gasket sealer. Some of the more popular brands are Air Seal, Lucky 7, but this is actually a 3-bond product, 1104, which is widely used in the motorcycle industry. It's basically a liquid gasket. So we're going to go ahead and prepare the case now. It can get a little bit messy, so I always recommend having a X-Acto blade. And what I'm going to do is, because it's a little bit gummy, I am going to use an X-Acto blade. And now that I have the gasket sealer on my X-Acto blade, I'm going to very carefully lay a bead on the surface. It's sometimes difficult to get it uniform, but as long as you have a decent bead around the surface, you're good to go. You can see how I'm just laying it on the surface with the knife itself, with the blade. Okay, now that I have a bead of sealant laid around the outer crankcase portion, we can go ahead and install the back plate. And again, here's where it all pays off when you lay everything out in order and you know your markings for the proper orientation of the part. I'm going to make sure that no sealant has dripped in the crankcase just by running my finger around. I'm verifying that my piston is at the highest in the stroke that it can go. I will take the back plate with the arrow pointing up with the groove and carefully insert it into the crankcase and align the screw holes. The final step is to take a little bit of sealant, just a little dab, and to just place a little bit on the end of each screw. That'll ensure that, say for some reason the tap went in too far into the crankcase, or there may be some casting voids, that it can't actually air leak through the threads themselves. So we're going to go ahead and install these now, all 4 of them, with just a little dab of sealant. Now that we've installed all 4 screws, before tightening everything up, I always like to double check the arrow is up, making sure that the surfaces are evenly tight. And then I'm going to go ahead and give it my final torque. Now that the back plate has been sealed and tightened, I put a little bit of nitro cleaner on a rag, and if there's any residual sealant that has squeezed out due to the cases coming together, I'm going to go ahead and clean that up very carefully. We're ready to reinstall the cylinder head now. You might be asking, why did I remove the cylinder head if I really didn't need to remove the sleeve of the piston? Well, it's actually a good idea to have a notebook and record and measure the shims. Now that we have the shims properly installed onto the combustion chamber, we're ready to install it back into the sleeve. I always recommend turning the actual engine upside down, because if you were to tilt the combustion chamber, you could lose a shim, and it's very easy to lose a shim, and your compression ratio will be off, and you could be out to lunch really quick trying to tune it. So once you've verified that the shims are the quantity and that they're installed correctly, very carefully, with a little bit of wiggling, you can get it to bottom out on the sleeve. And I always like making sure that once it's bottomed out, you can give it a twist just to make sure that nothing's hung up, and you're good to go to install. Okay, now that we have installed the combustion chamber back on to the engine itself, we always want to double check ourselves. Here are the machining marks that pointed towards the exhaust, and we've now verified that the cylinder head and its shims are correctly installed onto the engine. And we're now ready to go ahead and install the cooling head. Now that we've properly installed the combustion chamber, we're ready to install the cooling head. And again, the screws will go in as they came out. Sometimes you have to wiggle the head to get the screws to drop all the way down. You want to make sure that you see the 4 screws protruding out of the head. And again, this is very important. You must install the cooling head in the same direction that it came off the motor. We're good to go ahead and install it. If you notice, I did not place any sealant on these screws. It's very important that these screws are that they do not have sealant, because I could actually insulate the combustion chamber and the head from dissipating the heat properly. I'm going to go ahead and barely snug these down. You can see I'm just using 2 fingers first in a cross pattern. And now I'm ready to, I usually do it in about 2 steps with a quarter turn, about 1/8 of a turn each one. I'll sneak up on the final torque. So about 4 steps, 4 laps around doing the star pattern, then I'll set the screws at the final torque. So this would be my final pass here, and I'm bringing the screws up to their final torque. Okay, so we've gone through the sealing of the back plate. So now we're going to look at the carburetor and seal the carburetor onto the motor.